two, one, two, three.
Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. Today we'll be talking about housing financialization with David West. He's the Tompkins County planner for housing and community development. David West, say a little more about your background.
As you said, my title is Housing and Community Developer in the Tompkins County Department of Planning and Sustainability.
In Ithaca, most residents agree that rents are out of control. The same may apply to the prices to buy housing. You say that there are systematic reasons for this. What are they?
At the root level, we don't have the housing that we need for our community. So we have a shortage of the types of housing that are needed, and it's also really expensive to build new housing. So we have a mismatch there, both in the housing that we need, the housing that's available, and the cost to get new housing. Once you get over that cost of building new housing, we have a very difficult process for housing projects. It's very slow in most places. Within Tompkins County, projects of any substantial size are not allowed by right. So you are in some kind of negotiated multi-meeting review system that creates a lot of risk. And then we also have the problem of being kind of a small place that's far away from the next closest places with significant demand. So we don't have a lot of economies of scale. We don't have a workforce that's pumping out a lot of housing efficiently. So we have a lot of problems that combine on top of each other to make it really difficult to have the types of housing that we need at the price points that people can afford.
There was one even bigger or perhaps equally significant problem that you haven't even brought up yet.
Sure, that's what we're here to talk about today, financialization, right? So housing has become something that has a profit center in it that can be as much about creating and holding and increasing value as it is something that provides this really needed shelter and support that we all rely on. There's kind of a dichotomy there when housing cannot be at the same time permanently affordable and also a great investment that constantly becomes more valuable. Though you can't have both of those things at the same time. If home values keep going up, for the people who have access to that, it keeps getting more expensive, beyond the means of other people at the same time. So we have that dichotomy in our market. And when we have stacked things in favor of housing being a good investment that gets more valuable over time, that also makes it less affordable.
Right. And this is actually a bit of a controversial thing. I recall watching in Ithaca City Council when some house was foreclosed on and the city decided to sell it to Habitat for Humanity or maybe to INHS. And one of the council members at that time, it was probably about 5 years ago or so, Cynthia Brock, objected loudly because she said they would not allow the cost of the house, the land and the house to rise. It would be
Mm.
in what's often called a community land trust. Certainly that's the situation with INHS, and I think Habitat had some similar deal going on. Therefore, she objected to that whole process. Now,
Mhm.
she was roundly voted down.
Sure. Yeah, I think that it's a fantastic point, and it's something that I definitely think we should talk about in terms of solutions or partial solutions or things that help reduce the impacts of financialization in the housing market. So Tompkins County has been somewhat of a leader. There are other places that do this too. But in creating new housing that falls outside of the speculative housing market, housing that has a long-term value for shelter, but does not have as much of a financial value in that it can increase a lot over time. That's a really great model. The community land trust, locally, Ithaca Neighborhood Housing calls theirs a community housing trust. It's a piece of a larger suite of housing types that we call limited equity or shared equity housing, where we take the value of the housing as shelter and separate it from the value of housing as an investment. Economists that deal with this talk about ownership of housing coming with a bundle of rights that they describe. Different pieces of that bundle are, your ability to do what you want with your house, to paint your walls pink if you want to, or to remodel your house the way you want. That's one right that
I am
comes with having
laughing
housing. Yeah.
because I live in a historic district.
Mm.
Oh boy, can you not do what you want?
Yes, your bundle of rights is somewhat restricted, especially on the exterior of your house in a historic district. So that's one right, is to control your house. Another right that could come with a house is the ability to rent it or to sell it to make money. Another right is to live in it and have a safe place for your family. Another right is to be able to pass it on to other people in your family or to control what happens to it next. So in limited equity housing, basically you get most of those rights. You get the right to control your house, to change it the way you want, to live in it for as long as you want. But you put a limit on your ability to use it as a financial instrument to make as much profit as you want. The point of that is that when you sell it, it remains affordable to the next buyers. And it's something that's been used around the country in places experiencing gentrification to try to take a certain amount of the housing out of that speculative real estate model and keep it protected for people that have been in the neighborhood a long time or for people who make similar incomes as a bulwark against gentrification. There is always that argument, though, well, wouldn't it be great for people to be able to make a huge amount of money by living in a house for 10 years and then selling it for twice what they bought it for? And it's a trade-off. As soon as that happens, housing becomes unaffordable for anyone like those people. So people who think that they're more concerned about the long-term ability to use their house as shelter may appreciate having lower taxes because the value is lower, and also knowing that they're going to be able to pass that house on to another household that's similar to theirs, and not be a part of gentrifying a neighborhood. And that's really why INHS started it. I was actually an intern at the time that they were starting their community housing trust. And what they realized that got them started in that is that when they were formed as an organization, their goal was to help people in neighborhoods where you couldn't financialize housing. Actually, banks would not lend to homes in the north side and in the south side neighborhoods. They didn't think it was a safe investment. A lot of houses were changing hands for a dollar because you couldn't get a mortgage on them. They were kind of passed from family to family that way. It was really hard to get money to renovate them. So when INHS was founded, their goal was help people in these neighborhoods fix up their homes. They did classes on repairing windows. They did lending to those homes. But at some point in the late 90s, early 2000s, it started to become clear they'd put money into almost every house in the neighborhood. And the problems being experienced in those neighborhoods were no longer low housing quality and an inability to get lending. And in fact, the problem was becoming the housing's too expensive. People got support in fixing up a home. They were able to sell it, maybe make some money. The next buyers paid more. Those people were able to live it in a few years, sell it. The prices went up really quickly. And what they realized is that they needed to invest in a model that took some amount of housing out of that speculative market and kept it affordable so that in the long run, in the future, middle class and working class families will be able to afford to live in these neighborhoods in the city that they invest in.
I was actually interested when you mentioned houses selling for $1.
Hmm. I
But I think you mean at the point of passing from one inhabitant to another, perhaps
correct.
within a family or something. But the
Within
fun,
and without, yeah.
Mhm.
There
Yes,
were real deals happening that way, and there may have been other money changing hands outside of, the mortgage recording system. It's hard to know.
yeah.
But when as a resident of Southside, I've, researched different properties and their history, and you see these sales that were happening for very low dollar amounts. And I've also heard there were situations where properties were being held by other people for people that couldn't get financing or couldn't own the property otherwise.
I think I saw some noticed at some point that our house is recorded as having sold for $1, and that was absolutely not a matter of changing hands.
Mm.
It was simply a matter of when we bought the house, somehow the lawyer set up my partners and my ownership not the way we intended it to be, to work.
Okay.
Luckily, we both survived. Nothing changed. That wrong setup was never invoked. Another lawyer, a couple of decades later, I think,
Mm.
set it up the right way, the correct way, I mean. And I think it shows up on the record as a sale for $1.
Hmm.
But that was
Yeah.
a purely fictitious sale.
Yeah, that can happen, but I think at the root of that is the need for this model that really some of the pioneers of the community land trust model did a lot of work in Burlington, Vermont, where they have a municipal community land trust where the city government is a major partner in the land trust, and they set aside money every year. They buy up and repair houses. So they're building this inventory, not to be all of the housing market, but to be a piece that there is always some amount that people who want to own housing long term to be in the neighborhood, to own it for the pieces of that bundle of rights that aren't financialization, that aren't trying to make a profit, but are just wanting to live a life in that neighborhood so that there's an opportunity for that. It's really important in places where prices are going up quickly. And I can say that the county has actually made that a hallmark of our program. So the largest county involved program that funds affordable housing, the Community Housing Development Fund, which is a partnership between Tompkins County, the city of Ithaca, Cornell University, the town of Ithaca, and the town of Dryden. That program, when we invest in for sale homes, they have to be in a permanently affordable model like a community land trust so that they are out of the speculative real estate market so that they remain affordable, not just for the first household that we support getting in there, but for all households after them.
Oh, great. Wonderful. I hadn't even understood that, I must say. This problem with the financialization of a lot of our housing, has it always been the case? Was there a time when most people could afford most housing?
So it definitely is something that is changing, and we're seeing increasing financialization of the housing market. And what I mean by that is in the past, kind of before the mid-century in the US, it was more difficult to get financing for housing. You had to have a much larger down payment. The interest rates were much higher. But loans were held more locally. So when you took out a loan from the bank that was around the corner, that bank held your loan. You paid them the money. They got a return on it and reinvested it locally. It's kind of the classic model that you see in something like It's a Wonderful Life, right? Where you have a local bank that is owning the homes in the area, in a neighborhood, et cetera, and reinvesting that in the community. Since that time, the federal government got involved in trying to bring down the barriers to entry to housing. So we have Fannie and Freddie, institutions that basically purchase mortgages from banks, and banks then become involved mostly as an originator. So when you take out a loan from a bank, it's unlikely that they hold that loan. Most of the time, they package that loan with a bunch of other loans and they sell it either to Fannie and Freddie or to something like a REIT or an institutional investor that wants a whole lot of those loans, that spreads out the risk between the loans by having a lot of them. But that has led to some issues, including the 2008 housing crunch, when, a bunch of those packaged, securitized bundles of loans turned out to be mostly baloney because the people originating the loans got fees not based on the long-term viability of the loan, but just by making it. And they didn't have to worry about the risk involved because they immediately sold it. And maybe they owned it for a day or a week, but that's it. That additional complexity of bringing financial markets and additional profit into the housing space that has nothing to do with housing. It's not about building housing. It's not about maintaining housing. It's just about the financing of it and creating additional profit centers within the financing has added to the complexity and the expense and the profit motive in the housing industry. On top of that, we've added a lot of regulations, and a lot of them are well-intentioned and are about health and safety, which are fantastic things, but are also trade-off with expense. So we've added new requirements, such as sprinklers for all buildings, which that alone can easily add $10,000, $20,000 to the cost of a house or an apartment. We have requirements that don't exist in other countries. And I think you've talked about some of them on the show before, like having two stairways in an apartment building instead of one that add a lot of additional cost. And then we also have very complex bureaucratic systems of review, both in zoning that doesn't allow multifamily development in most places, and then just site plan review and processes that can add a lot of time and a lack of clarity and assurance to projects that make a lot of projects not even start from the get-go. So those things together, we've gone from having the availability of cheap, really low quality housing that people could buy. And you and I have spoken about the Chuck Marohn book, Escaping the Housing Trap, where he essentially says we used to allow people to live in a tar paper shack, and that was a house that they could afford, they could build it themselves. But we've essentially decided now that we would rather they be homeless than live in a house that's below the standard of safety and health that we set. So we have come down in an agreement in a trade-off between health, safety, attractiveness, neighborhood character, things like that, on a side that new housing is so expensive to build that we basically decided we're okay with a lot of people being homeless if they can't afford the level of essentially middle class amenities that we want to see in housing.
I don't know if you call all these things middle class amenities. Being safe from fire. Is that a middle class privilege?
It's something that's expensive, right? I mean, I think it comes from the progressive era. When I say progressive era, I mean the 1920s reforms that were happening in city government that we call the progressive era, that really was looking at things like tenements and slums and saying that's unacceptable. We want people to have a different standard of living. And I think that comes from a really good place that we do want people to have there is a minimum that we should consider unacceptable. The question is where you fall on that line of what is acceptable, what isn't acceptable. And we kind of have two options. If you say that there's something that's not acceptable and what's acceptable is expensive, either you need to publicly subsidize that, which we don't do. We don't provide enough public subsidy to reach that, or you need to make it reachable in some other way. And I think a lot of that is where we've fallen down as a industry, as a society. We're not grappling with that. What do we actually need to do to provide decent housing that's affordable to everyone?
And that can be a kind of cultural thing, as I came to see from, well, living in Yugoslavia back
Mm,
when housing was very well constructed. In fact, well, we were living in Zagreb. It's an earthquake zone,
mhm,
but often apartments were often very small and with, I would say, larger numbers of people living in one than would be tolerated here.
mhm. Yeah, when you look globally at what the middle class housing is, the global middle is very different from our United States middle for sure. And that comes in size, it comes in density, it comes in the amenities that we expect to see in that housing, and the way it gets built, honestly.
Yeah. Well, and some other things are what is often forbidden by our zoning, those third places. We need large houses, so to speak, and large apartments because we're expected to entertain people in them. In those places with smaller units are the standard. There are oodles of cafes all over the place. And
Right.
that's
I
where
think
you go. And
absolutely. I think there's growing awareness that a lot of people today are actually choosing their housing by the neighborhood and not by the square feet. And a lot of people who build housing, it used to be that you thought all about housing in terms of the cost per square foot and where can I get the most square feet for the lowest price. But I think the market has shifted and people want to be part of a neighborhood that's more than what you have inside your house. It's about what you have when you step out. And that means you can have a smaller unit. You may prefer a smaller, nicer unit. If you can put those same dollars into less space, you can have higher quality finishes, you can have kind of a nicer environment inside. But also, if you can allow businesses around it and you have enough density to support those businesses, that makes your neighborhood a more interesting place. But starting in the mid-century, we basically outlawed that almost everywhere in the United States. We started single-use zoning that was intended to not allow businesses in neighborhoods. And so we went from a neighborhood like Fall Creek in Ithaca that had around 30 grocery outlets around the early 1900s to, saying that that was terrible. And why would we want someone to be able to sell, specialty food out of their living room? We're going to have instead supermarket that you need a car to get to because it's 2 miles away. And instead of shopping every day on your way home from work, you're going to shop every 2 weeks. And so now you need all of this additional expensive infrastructure to live that different lifestyle.
another kind of related to the finance side, housing is increasingly unaffordable for many working class households. In a capitalist market, why isn't there an entrepreneur finding a way to make money selling homes that working class people can afford?
I think it's a great question. That's kind of what we always tell ourselves about the way the market is supposed to work, right? That somebody will find a way to make a profit providing whatever it is that people need. But we don't actually have a completely free market, and the market is not serving people at the bottom end of the income spectrum. So right now, because of the requirements we have about what the minimum quality of housing is and what that costs to build, and because of the way that housing is financialized, you can't make money building housing to rent to low and sometimes even moderate income people. The rents that they can achieve are just too low for that to make financial sense. And even if you owned housing outright, just the taxes and the maintenance of that housing can often be more expensive than, say, $600 a month, which we would love to have a lot of housing for people that could only afford $600 a month. So essentially, we're left with an industry of government subsidized housing that ends up being very expensive to provide. We do have some for-profit firms that dabble in that have become expert at getting those government incentives.
Maybe expert
So
at getting those government incentives, but not expert at running the housing. If you look at the Vecino, let's
it
say.
can it can definitely go, there are mixed incentives, I will say. And I will say that there are some for-profit affordable housing developers that do a great job, and there are some that don't. And we have a lot of nonprofit housing developers that do a great job at providing really high quality subsidized housing. But that housing is highly subsidized. It's incredibly expensive to provide. We're talking $300,000 or more for an apartment to get constructed. And it's because there's all these layers of different programs that have to be involved, different management that you have to have. It is more difficult to manage housing when you have people who are working multiple jobs and have different destabilizing events in their lives and families. But working with the programs themselves is a huge added cost and makes it difficult to provide that housing at a low rate. So we really are in a situation where we can't, the market makes sense in Tompkins County to build housing at the very top of the market. That can make money. It's still risky. I would say it is not, a sure thing that a project is going to make money at all. And we have projects that have lost money, lost millions of dollars. But in general, it is possible to build a project at the high end of the market. And then it is possible to build projects at the cheapest end of the market with a lot of government subsidy, but it really isn't possible to build much in between because the costs of construction are so high and the process is so risky.
Thank you, David West, for your rundown on what makes housing so expensive in Ithaca and many other places.
There are things we can do around that system to make a difference. But we also have to understand the math and understand the reality of it. It doesn't help anything to kind of go in with magical thinking. So if we're going to get to making something work, we need to understand the details.
This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. Thanks for watching.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.